Hey everyone. And before we start, I just want to give a huge, heartfelt thank you to all of you, especially my viewers in the States, for choosing to spend your time here with my family's story. The support has been, well, it's been everything. So if you enjoy these deep dives into the past, please consider hitting that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. All right, let's get into it. This was my grandma, Evelyn. To the world, and to me for most of my life, she was the perfect grandmother. The smell of cinnamon and baked apples followed her like a shadow. Her hugs could fix just about anything. She was my safe place. But people, they're like old houses, aren't they? With rooms you never knew existed. My grandma had a room like that, except it wasn't a room, it was a garden, and the door to it was locked my entire life. When she passed away, I thought I was just inheriting her house and a lifetime of sweet memories. I was wrong. She left me a key that unlocked that garden, and a secret so dark it had been buried for 70 years. A story of forbidden love, a devastating tragedy, and a family scandal so profound, they tried to erase a life from existence. And I've come to realize this wasn't just a story she wanted me to know. This was her final, silent act of revenge. Part 1, The Inheritance. Narrator, the days after the funeral were a thick, gray fog. The sympathy cards piled up on the mantelpiece, their cursive condolences all blurring into one meaningless platitude. People came and went, leaving casseroles in the fridge that I had no appetite to eat. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones about what a wonderful woman Evelyn was, and I would nod, a hollow feeling echoing in my chest, because none of them truly knew her. I was beginning to realize that I didn't either. The house itself seemed to be grieving. The floors creaked with a sorrowful weight, and the afternoon light, slanting through the dusty windows, seemed weary. It was into this fragile quiet that my great uncle Robert came. He didn't knock, just let himself in with the key he had. I heard his heavy, purposeful footsteps on the hardwood floor of the hall before I saw him. He found me in the living room, staring at a wall of photographs, a gallery of smiling faces that felt like a mockery. He was holding a sleek leather briefcase that looked completely alien amongst my grandmother's floral furniture. Robert, Lily, there you are. I was hoping I'd find you in. How are you holding up? Lily, I'm all right, Uncle Robert. Narrator, it was a lie, a social grease we applied to keep conversations moving. He didn't press. He wasn't here for my emotional state. He was here for business. Robert, good, that's good. Listen, I know this is a difficult time, but we need to be pragmatic. I've taken the liberty of speaking to a realtor. Howard Vance, best in the county. He's very optimistic about the market right now. Thinks we can get this place sold, settled before the first frost. Narrator, he said it all so smoothly, so matter-of-factly, as if he were discussing a stock portfolio. He paced back and forth in front of the fireplace, his gaze sweeping the room, but not in a sentimental way. He was assessing it. I could almost see the dollar signs clicking in his eyes as he looked at the hardwood floors, the original crown molding. Lily sold? Uncle Robert, the funeral was 4 days ago. I haven't even gone through her knitting basket yet. I can't think about selling her house. Robert, he stopped pacing and turned to me, his expression one of carefully practiced patience. The kind a parent uses on a difficult child. And that's why I'm here, to handle the unpleasant details, to take the burden off your shoulders. Your grandmother, above all else, was a practical woman. She wouldn't want you saddled with an old house. The upkeep alone. Lily, you have no idea. The property taxes, the heating bills, the plumbing in these old homes is a nightmare waiting to happen. She would want you to take the inheritance, a considerable sum, I might add, and use it to build your own future, not to be anchored to her past. Lily, this house is my past too. It's not an anchor. It's all I have left of her. Robert. That's just the grief talking, and that's understandable. But sentimentality is a luxury that can be very, very expensive. Howard, the realtor, said he could come by tomorrow, just for a preliminary look. No commitments, narrator. The pressure was gentle but relentless, like a rising tide. Every word was designed to make me feel small, impractical, overly emotional. He was framing his haste as a kindness, a favor to me, but it felt suffocating. It felt like he was trying to scrub the memory of her from the earth as quickly as possible. I looked at this man, my grandmother's brother, and for the first time, I saw a stranger. A stranger with an agenda I couldn't yet comprehend. Part 2, Whispers from Next Door. Narrator, I managed to put Robert off, telling him I needed at least a month. He left with a sigh of thinly veiled disapproval, reminding me again not to be guided by emotion. His visit left me agitated, the quiet grief of the house now replaced by a humming suspicion. I went out to the front porch, just to breathe air that wasn't thick with the past. I was mindlessly watering my grandmother's petunias, their purple heads drooping sadly, when Mrs. Gable from next door waved at me from her prize winning rose bushes. She was a fixture of the neighborhood, a woman whose memory was as long and tangled as the roots of the ancient oak tree that separated our properties. Mrs. Gable, hello, dear. It's good to see you up and about. It's a hard thing. A hard, quiet thing. Lily, it is. Thank you, Mrs. Gable. Mrs. Gable, she snipped a faded rose with practiced care, her movements slow and deliberate. I was just thinking about your grandmother this morning. I remember when she first moved into this house with your grandfather. Seems like a lifetime ago. She was always a good neighbor, kept to herself, but always had a kind word. She was a very quiet woman. Lily, was she always like that? Quiet, narrator, the question slipped out before I could stop it. It was a baited hook, and Mrs. Gable looked at me, her sharp eyes assessing me for a long moment before she decided to bite. Mrs. Gable? Oh, heavens no. Don't let the end of a story fool you about the beginning. When Evelyn was a girl, 16, 17, she was a firecracker, a real spitfire. She had this laugh that would just burst out of her. Made you want to laugh too, even if you didn't know the joke. She had a light in her, a bright, burning light. Lily, what happened to it? Mrs. Gable, she sighed, a long, slow exhalation of breath and leaned against her fence. Life happened, dear. This town happened. Her father happened. And a boy named Arthur Pennington happened. A boy who was from the wrong side of the tracks, as they used to say. A boy with engine grease under his fingernails and a smile that could charm a snake. Her father, Councilman Walker, he was a man made of pride and public opinion. He couldn't abide it. He saw the boy as a stain on his family's good name. Lily, so he made them break up. Mrs. Gable, oh, it was more than that. There was a terrible row. The boy disappeared practically overnight. And after that, the light in Evelyn just went out. It flickered for a while, but it was never the same. She learned to be quiet. She learned to be invisible. It was a tragedy what they did to that girl's spirit. A real tragedy. Narrator, she patted my hand over the fence, her touch soft and papery. You have a good heart, Lily, just like her. She went back to her roses, leaving me on the porch with a new piece of the puzzle. A name, Arthur Pennington, and the chilling image of my grandmother's light being extinguished. Part 3, The Key and the Riddle. The narrator. That night, sleep was impossible. The names Arthur and Pennington played a repeating loop in my mind. The house felt different again. The gentle sadness was gone, replaced by a sense of injustice. I felt like a detective who had just been handed her first real clue. I needed to find something, some proof, some acknowledgement of this story that had been so thoroughly erased. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just knew I had to search. I started in the attic, a dusty repository of forgotten things. Old trunks filled with clothes that smelled of mothballs, stacks of yellowed newspapers, a broken rocking horse. Nothing. I moved to the basement with its damp, earthy smell and its shelves of preserved fruits in dusty mason jars, a skill she had tried and failed to teach me. Nothing. Finally, defeated, I went to her bedroom. It felt like the heart of the mystery. I sat on her bed, the floral quilt cool beneath my hands. Where would a person hide a memory? Where would you put the one piece of a story you weren't allowed to tell, but couldn't bear to destroy? I started with her closet again, then her dresser. Then, on a whim, I got on my hands and knees and looked at the simple, mahogany bedside table. It was just a plain, sturdy piece of furniture. But my fingers traced the underside of the top drawer, a place no one would ever see or clean. And I felt it. A small, square bulge under a layer of brittle, yellowed tape. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. It was a slow, painstaking process to peel the tape away without it crumbling to dust. Finally, a small, heavy, cold object fell into my palm. A key. It was made of dark, rusted iron with an ornate, clover-shaped head. It was a key from a fairy tale or a nightmare. With it was a folded envelope, so old the paper was the color of weak tea. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely unfold the single sheet inside. Her handwriting was there, elegant as always, but shaky, as if each word was a monumental effort. It wasn't a letter. It was a riddle, a final, cryptic command. Where the sun sleeps and the weeping angel cries, my heart is buried. Forgive me, I read it over and over. It wasn't the rambling of an old woman. It was a map to her heart, and she was asking for forgiveness. For what? For the secret she kept? Or for the burden she was now placing on me? I didn't know, but I knew I had no choice but to follow it to the end. Part 4. The Guardian of the Lie. Narrator. I sat on the floor of my grandmother's bedroom for what felt like hours, the iron key cold and heavy in my palm, the cryptic note lying next to me on the worn rug. The silence of the house was no longer just sad, it was charged, thrumming with the energy of a secret on the verge of being told. I knew what I had to do next. It wasn't just about finding what was in the garden. It was about understanding the lie that had guarded it for so long. And there was only one guardian of that lie still living. I picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over Uncle Robert's name in my contacts. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. What was my plan? To accuse him? He would deny everything, call me hysterical, and I had no proof yet, just a key and a riddle. No, I couldn't confront him directly. I had to test him. I had to walk him to the edge of the lie and see if he would jump or if he would try to push me away. I took a deep breath, steadied my hand, and pressed the call button. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and impatient. Robert, Lily, is everything all right? Lily, yes, everything's fine. I was just calling about the house. I was in the attic earlier and I was wondering. Did Grandma ever talk about her parents? About what the town was like when she was young? Narrator. I started with a harmless question, a piece of bait. I could almost hear him relax on the other end of the line, settling into the role of the knowledgeable elder. Robert, your great grandfather? A fine man, a pillar of this community. He built a good life for his family, a respected name. It was a different time, of course, simpler. People valued decorum, family honor. Your grandmother was a good daughter. Quiet, respectful. Narrator, quiet, respectful. The same words he used before. A carefully curated, approved narrative. Now for the real test. Lily, I was just walking the property line at the back of the house. That old garden. The one behind the iron gate. It must have been beautiful once. Narrator, a pause, not a long one, but a fraction of a second of dead air that was more telling than any word. Robert, that old thing? Heavens, no, it was always a mess. Overgrown, unsafe. That's why father had it fenced off in the first place years ago. We didn't want your father or me wandering in there and getting hurt as boys. Full of rusted tools, snakes, it's a blight on the property, honestly. Part of the reason a developer would be so appealing, they could clear all that junk out. Lily, I see, it's strange though, I found a key. Narrator, this time the silence was longer. It was a weighted silence, the kind where you can hear the gears turning in someone's mind, clicking through options, calculating risks. Robert, his voice, when it returned, was coated in a thick layer of feigned concern. A key. Lily, what have you been getting up to? I hope you're not letting your imagination run away with you. You're grieving. It's perfectly natural to become a bit fixated on things, to look for meaning where there is none. An old key could be for anything. A shed that rotted away before you were born. A toolbox, it means nothing. Lily, it was with a note from her. She wanted me to find it. Narrator, that was it, the final move. I had laid all my cards on the table. The reaction was instantaneous. The mask of calm concern melted away, replaced by the raw, hot anger of a man whose authority had been challenged. Robert, a note. For God's sake, Lily, are you listening to yourself? A note, your grandmother was an 85-year-old woman. Her mind was not what it once was. She was getting sentimental, confused. Are you going to build a fantasy around the ramblings of a sick old woman? Is that how you want to remember her, by entertaining this nonsense? Lily, it didn't seem like nonsense to me. It seemed important. Robert, important. I'll tell you what's important. What's important is preserving the dignity of her memory. What's important is being practical and responsible. What's important is that you stop acting like a child playing detective and listen to me. I am the executor of this family's estate and its legacy. I am telling you, for your own good and out of respect for your grandmother, you will drop this. You will put that key away and you will not go into that garden. Am I making myself clear? Narrator, it was an order, a threat veiled as protection. The fury in his voice was the sound of pure panic. He wasn't guarding her dignity. He was guarding a lie. And I knew with absolute certainty that whatever that lie was, it was hidden behind that iron gate. I murmured a quiet okay and ended the call, my hand shaking with adrenaline. The test was complete. The guardian had revealed himself. Narrator, after the call with Robert, the house felt too small, its walls too close. I was filled with a nervous, defiant energy. I grabbed the heavy iron key, its rust leaving a red stain on my palm, and walked out the back door. The air was cool and crisp, but it did nothing to calm the storm inside me. I walked across the manicured lawn, a stretch of green that ended abruptly at the tall, foreboding iron gate that separated the known world from the unknown. It stood there, wreathed in ivy, like the entrance to a forgotten cemetery. The key felt alien in the lock. It was a piece of the past, forced into the present. I had to put my shoulder into it, turning with all my strength. For a moment, there was only resistance, the unyielding stubbornness of 70 years of stillness. Then, a sound like a gunshot, a sharp, percussive crack as the rusted inner workings of the lock finally surrendered. The sound echoed in the quiet afternoon. I pulled the gate open. It moved with a low, agonizing groan, like a great beast waking from a long slumber. The air that flowed out to meet me was the first true thing I had experienced all week. It was thick and heavy, carrying the complex perfume of profound neglect. It smelled of damp, black earth, of a million leaves decaying into soil, of rainwater that had never seen the sun. It was the smell of a sealed room, of a story that had been suffocating in the dark. I stepped through, and the gate swung slowly shut behind me, the latch clicking softly into place. I was inside. The world was different here. The light was different, filtered through a dense canopy of overgrown branches, dappling the ground in shades of green and gray. The silence was different, too. It wasn't the empty silence of the house. It was a deep, living silence, filled with the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth and the sigh of the wind through the gnarled limbs of a dying elm tree. It was a wilderness, but it was a structured wilderness. I could see the ghost of what it once was. A stone path, now almost completely swallowed by moss and weeds, curved away into the shadows. A stone bird bath, green with algae and filled with black, stagnant water, was tilted on its side, a testament to a long ago frost heave. I saw what must have been a rose garden, now a tangled, thorny mass of woody canes, a fortress of thorns with no flowers to protect. It was a place of immense beauty and immense violence. Nature's slow, relentless violence against a human dream. I walked slowly, my feet sinking into the soft, damp ground. I reached out and touched the bark of a massive oak tree, its surface rough and furrowed like an old man's skin. A single, rusted chain hung from one of its thick branches, swaying slightly in the breeze. The ghost of a swing, the ghost of a child's laughter. I sat on a stone bench near the tree, its surface cold and slick with moss. I didn't search for anything, I just sat and breathed and listened. I was trying to absorb the story of the place through my skin. I could feel the sorrow here. It was in the soil, in the air. This wasn't just a forgotten garden. It was a place that had been deliberately, meticulously sentenced to death. It was a sanctuary of ruin. Part 6: The Angel and the Urn. Narrator: I must have sat on that bench for an hour, letting the profound sadness of the place seep into my bones. Then I remembered the riddle. Where the sun sleeps and the weeping angel cries. I stood up. The sun was beginning its slow descent in the west, and I knew that's where I had to go. I pushed my way through a thicket of ferns, their fronds cool and wet against my skin, and followed the overgrown path toward the far end of the property. And then I saw her, the angel. She was smaller than I had imagined from my childhood memories, half swallowed by the encroaching wilderness. She was carved from marble that had once been white, but was now a mottled gray-green, streaked with black veins of moss and lichen that looked like tears running from her stone eyes. Her head was bowed, her hands clasped in prayer, and one of her wings had a piece chipped away, making her look wounded, broken. She was sinking back into the earth, a monument of grief being reclaimed by the very ground she was meant to watch over. I knelt in front of her, my knees sinking into the damp soil. The riddle said my grandmother's heart was buried here. I began to run my hands over the stone plinth that served as the angel's base. It was made of flat, fitted stones. I felt each one. They were cold, solid, seamless. I moved around to the back, to the part that faced the setting sun. I continued my search, my fingers tracing the lines, feeling for any incongruity. And then I found it. One stone, squarer than the others, had a slightly wider gap around it. It didn't sit quite flush. It was a lid. My heart was pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm. I dug my fingernails into the crack and pulled. It wouldn't budge, sealed by decades of dirt and moisture. I found a sharp-edged rock nearby and used it as a makeshift tool, scraping at the dirt, jamming it into the crack to use as a lever. For long minutes, nothing happened. My fingers were raw, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, with a low, sucking sound of release, the stone came loose. I lifted it away. Beneath it was a dark, square cavity, lined with damp, black earth. And nestled in the center of that cavity, like a buried heart in a broken chest, was a small tin box. It was rusted almost completely brown, the metal pitted and scarred by its long interment. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a shoebox for a child's shoes. I reached in and lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked, its weight both physical and symbolic. I didn't open it there. It felt wrong, like a desecration. This was a private grief, and I needed to bring it back into the privacy of the house. I carried it carefully, with both hands, as if it were a fragile, sleeping creature. The walk back through the dying garden felt different now. I was no longer an explorer. I was a pallbearer. I placed the box on the clean, sun-drenched surface of the kitchen table. The contrast was jarring. The box was an object of darkness and decay, an artifact from the underworld, now sitting in the heart of my grandmother's warm, cheerful kitchen. I spent a long time just looking at the caked-on dirt and the filigree of rust. I tried to pry the lid open with my fingers, but it was sealed shut. I found a butter knife in a drawer and began to work it into the seam, carefully, painstakingly. The sound of the metal scraping against the rusted tin was the only sound in the house. With each small movement, my anticipation grew until it was a painful pressure in my chest. Finally, with a last, wrenching twist, the seal broke with a groan of protest. The lid came loose. I paused, took a deep, shuddering breath, and lifted it off. I looked inside. The smell of dust, of dry paper, of time itself, rose up to meet me. It was an urn, filled not with ashes, but with the preserved remnants of a life that was never lived. Part 7, The Relics. Narrator, the past has a scent. It's not just the musty smell of age. It's the dry, papery scent of memory itself, of emotions trapped in fiber and celluloid for decades. That was the scent that rose from the tin box. I stood there for a long moment, simply breathing it in, preparing myself for what I was about to see. This was a tomb, and I was its sole visitor. With hands that felt strangely disconnected from my body, I reached inside. The first thing my fingers touched was something impossibly soft and light. I lifted it out into the light of the kitchen. It was a lock of hair, fine and pale as spun moonlight, tied with a simple blue silk ribbon that had faded to the color of a hazy sky. A baby's first curl. I held it in the palm of my hand. It weighed nothing, yet it felt heavier than anything I had ever held. This was a physical piece of a person who had lived and breathed in this house. I imagined my grandmother's young hands, her fingers carefully tying this ribbon, her heart swelling with the simple, fierce pride that only a mother can know. An act of love, an act of preservation. A hopeful promise, saved in a tin box buried in the dark. I placed the lock of hair gently on the table, as if it might turn to dust, and reached back into the box. My fingers closed around something solid and cool. A pair of tiny leather shoes. They were stiff with age, the leather cracked like drought-ridden earth. The laces were gone. They were so small, they fit entirely in the palm of my hand. They were the most heartbreaking things I had ever seen. Shoes are for journeys, for taking first steps, for toddling across a lawn, for running into a mother's arms. These shoes had been meant for a life of forward momentum, but their journey had ended here in this box. I turned one over and saw, on the tiny leather sole, a faint scuff mark near the toe. He had worn them. Samuel had worn these shoes. He had kicked his feet, maybe even tried to stand. He was not just a lock of hair. He was a body in motion, a life brimming with potential, a journey cut short. The immensity of that loss, embodied in this tiny, scuffed shoe, was staggering. Beneath the shoes lay a photograph. A square photograph with the scalloped edges of a bygone era. I picked it up. The black and white image was faded, but the faces were clear, and my breath caught in my throat. I was looking at a woman I did not know. She looked like my grandmother, but it was a version of her from a different universe. This woman, this girl, was maybe 19. Her face was rounder, unlined by worry, and her smile. It was not the gentle, sad smile I knew. This was a smile of pure, uninhibited, radiant joy. A joy so powerful it seemed to light up the photograph from within. She wasn't looking at the camera. Her entire being, her whole world was tilted downwards, focused on the baby cradled in her arms. A chubby, beautiful baby with a shock of light hair and a serious expression, held so securely, so lovingly. This was Evelyn before the quiet. This was Evelyn before the sadness. This was the woman whose light Mrs. Gable had told me about. And seeing her like this, so full of life and love, made the reality of the quiet, subdued woman she became even more of a crime. What could possibly have happened to extinguish such a brilliant light? What darkness could be so absolute? The answer, I suspected, lay at the bottom of the box. There was one last item, folded into a neat, tight square. A document. The paper was yellowed and brittle at the creases. I unfolded it with the care of a historian handling an ancient manuscript. It was a birth certificate from the county clerk's office. The typed, impersonal letters stood in stark contrast to the emotional weight of the other objects. I read the words, and the world tilted on its axis. Name of child, Samuel Evan Walker. I whispered his name aloud. Samuel, the crying baby in my dream. The ghost now had a name, an official, government-sanctioned name. He was real. Name of mother, Evelyn Walker, my grandmother. It was true, all of it. Name of father, Arthur Pennington. There it was. The name Mrs. Gable had whispered. The name that had made my Uncle Robert's voice turn to ice. The missing piece, the motive. This single sheet of paper was the nexus of the entire secret, the concrete proof of a story that my entire family had conspired to deny, to erase, to bury in the cold, damp earth. The betrayal I felt was a physical thing, a cold stone in my stomach. They had all lied. For 70 years, they had all been guardians of this lie. And then I saw what lay beneath the spot where the certificate had been. The foundation of the entire collection. 3 small, identical books bound in dark, cracked leather. They weren't relics of the baby. They were relics of the mother. They were her testimony. The objects had shown me what had been lost. These diaries, I knew, would tell me how. With a deep, trembling breath that felt like I was about to plunge underwater, I reached for the first one. Part 8, The Gospel of Evelyn. Narrator, the world outside the kitchen window disappeared. The hum of the refrigerator faded. My own life, my own time, dissolved as I opened the first diary. The pages were filled with my grandmother's elegant, youthful script, the ink a faded blue-black. This wasn't just a record of events. It was a confession, a love letter, a scream of rage, a prayer of grief. I didn't just read it. I fell into it. The first diary began in the spring of 1951. It was filled with the breathless, heart-pounding excitement of first love. She wrote about Arthur not as a boy with grease under his fingernails, but as a kind of god. Evelynvo, a younger, more vibrant voice. April 12th, 1951. Arthur gave me his pin today. He bought it with his own money from the garage. It's just tin, but it feels like silver when I touch it. He pinned it to my collar right there in the town square, bold as anything. He said he wanted everyone to know I was his girl. My heart beat so fast I thought I would faint. Father would kill me if he knew. He says the Penningtons are nothing but trouble, that they're beneath us. He doesn't understand. Arthur isn't beneath us. He's from a different world, a world where people are real, where they work with their hands and dream with their whole hearts. He's my everything. Narrator, I could feel her defiance, her youthful certainty. She wrote about their secret meetings by the creek, about the plans they made to escape our small, suffocating town. She wrote about the first time he kissed her, how the world seemed to stop. And then, the tone began to change. The fear began to creep in at the edges of the pages. Evelynvo, July 16th, 1951. My brother Robert saw us today. We were just walking by the creek, holding hands. He didn't say anything. He just stood on the path and watched us, his face hard and closed. It was the look on his face. It wasn't just disapproval. It was disgust. He looked at me like I was something dirty, something that had betrayed our family's good name. I saw my father in his eyes. It made me cold all over. Narrator, I turned the page, and the next entry was from 3 months later. The ink was darker, the letters pressed harder into the paper. EVELYNVO. October 5th, 1951. I have missed my monthly. I am sick every morning. I know what it means. I was so scared I couldn't breathe. I thought Arthur would leave me. I thought my life was over. I told him tonight by the old oak tree, my voice shaking so much I could barely speak. He didn't run. He didn't get angry. He fell to his knees and put his hands on my stomach and he cried, tears of pure joy. He held me so tight and promised we would run away, get married, and build a life for our baby. He said he would work 3 jobs if he had to. We're going to name him Samuel. For the first time, my fear turned into hope. We could do this, we could have our own world. Narrator, but their world was not their own. It belonged to her father. The second diary was a testament to that. It was a chronicle of a war, one she was destined to lose. I read about the confrontation, about the day her world was torn apart. She described it in excruciating, vivid detail. EVELYNVO, March 20th, 1952. It's over. A living nightmare. Father found my letters. He and Robert confronted Arthur at his house. I heard the shouting from the road. I ran. I saw my father wave a piece of paper in Arthur's face. He called him trash. He said he'd have him arrested for corrupting a minor. He said he would ruin his family. Robert just stood there, behind father, like a soldier. They put Arthur in his cousin's car and sent him away to a job in another state. Robert held my arm as the car drove away. I was screaming his name. I was fighting, scratching at him. He just held on, his grip like iron, his face a mask of cold duty. He just said, "It's for your own good, Evelyn. You'll thank us one day." I will never thank him. I will die hating him for what he did today. Narrator. The final diary was the slimmest. Its pages were few, and many were stained with what I knew were tears. It was a gospel of grief. It chronicled the secret birth, the stolen moments of joy in the attic, the constant fear of discovery. And then the final entry. The entry for August 10th, 1952. The handwriting was barely legible, a wild, jagged scrawl. It was the sound of a soul being shattered into a million pieces. It was the story of the well. It was the story of how her son was erased. And as I read the final, chilling words, they buried my son in the dark while I was locked in my room. They told me to forget, but a mother never forgets. I knew my next destination. The time for testing the lie was over. It was time to confront the liar. Narrator. When I finally closed the last diary, my grandmother's kitchen was no longer a warm, familiar space. It had become a courtroom. The walls were a silent, judging jury. The overhead light was an interrogation lamp, and I was no longer a grieving granddaughter. I was a witness. No, I was more. I was the embodiment of her vengeance, a vengeance that didn't demand blood, but demanded truth. The sorrow inside me had crystallized. It had become something cold and sharp and heavy. It was rage. A pure, righteous rage, 70 years in the making. I didn't wipe the tears from my face. I let them dry there like war paint. I picked up my car keys. I didn't take the diaries. I didn't need them. Every single word was now seared into my mind. Driving to Uncle Robert's house, the world outside the window seemed unreal. The familiar streets, the neat houses, the manicured lawns, it was all part of a grand stage play, a performance of normalcy and respectability, masking the rot underneath. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I didn't rehearse what I was going to say. I didn't have to. I wouldn't be using my words. I would be using hers. I parked across the street from his perfect brick house. I didn't go to the front door. I walked around the side, to the back patio where he often sat to read in the evenings. And there he was, in a cushioned wicker chair, a glass of iced tea sweating on a small table beside him. He was reading a financial magazine, completely absorbed in his world of numbers and profits. A clean, orderly world. I stepped onto the flagstones of the patio, and the sound of my footsteps made him look up, a frown of annoyance at the interruption crossing his face. Robert, Lily, what are you doing here? Is everything all right? Narrator. I didn't answer his question. I just stood there, looking at him, letting the silence stretch, letting my presence curdle the comfortable evening air. He began to shift in his chair, putting the magazine down. Lily, my voice came out steady, chillingly calm, without a tremor. I read the diaries, Uncle Robert. Narrator. The change in his face was subtle but total. The mask of the concerned, practical uncle disintegrated. For a fraction of a second, before he could construct another one, I saw it. The pure, primal panic of a cornered animal. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a wall of stern denial. Robert, diaries? What diaries? Lily, I think the stress of all this is getting to you. Your grandmother didn't keep diaries. Lily, she did, 3 of them. She kept them in a tin box buried at the feet of a weeping angel. Does that sound familiar? Narrator, his face paled, but his voice was firm, condescending. You've been trespassing on a dangerous part of the property after I explicitly told you not to. And you found some old storybooks, some teenage fantasy your grandmother wrote and forgot about 60 years ago. This is ridiculous. Lily, her handwriting was very clear. She wrote about Arthur Pennington. She wrote about you seeing them by the creek. She wrote about the look of disgust on your face. Robert, he stood up then, his chair scraping against the stone. He used his height to try and intimidate me, his voice rising. This is character assassination. You're taking the sentimental scribblings of an old woman and twisting them into something ugly. I was a boy. I was loyal to my father, to my family. Something you clearly don't understand. Lily. She wrote about the night you sent Arthur away. She wrote, Robert held my arm as the car drove away. I was screaming. Do you remember that, Uncle Robert? Do you remember the feeling of her fighting you? Robert. I remember a hysterical girl who was throwing her life away. I remember saving her from a mistake that would have ruined her. Yes, I remember it, and I was right to do it. Lily, and Samuel, was his death for her own good, too. She wrote that you were watching him. She wrote that you were the last person to see him alive before. The well? Narrator, that was the word, the forbidden word, the one that held all the power. His rage collapsed into something else, something sputtering and desperate. Robert, it was an accident, a tragic, horrible accident. How dare you suggest otherwise? Lily, she was locked in her room, wasn't she? While her son's body was being pulled from that well, you and your father locked her in her room. Why? If it was just an accident, why was she a prisoner? Narrator, he had no answer. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently. He was undone. I took a step closer, my voice dropping to a whisper. Lily, she wrote, they buried my son in the dark. They told me to forget. Did you help bury him, Uncle Robert? Did you help put him in the ground and then tell your sister to forget her own child? Narrator, and then he broke. It wasn't a dignified shattering. It was the ugly, total collapse of a lifetime of lies. He sank back into his chair, his face in his hands, and a sound came out of him, a ragged, wretched sob. Robert, he made me. Father, he said it was my fault, my responsibility. He said the family had to be cleansed. He watched me dig. He put the key to the gate in my hand himself. He said, this is your burden now as much as mine. What was I supposed to do? I was 17. He was my father. I was so scared. I was just so scared. Narrator. He wept. He wept for the boy he was, for the man he became, for the secret that had hollowed him out. But his tears brought me no peace, no satisfaction. I looked at the broken old man in his expensive wicker chair, surrounded by his perfect life, and I felt nothing but a vast, cold emptiness. The truth was out, but it had healed nothing. I turned and walked away, leaving him alone with his 70-year-old ghosts. Part 10: The Final Witness. Narrator: The confrontation with Robert didn't bring the closure I had hoped for. Vindicating my grandmother's truth felt righteous, but it also felt incomplete. Her story wasn't just one of betrayal and loss at the hands of her family. It began as a story of love, a love that had been violently silenced. Robert was the guardian of the lie, but there was another witness out there somewhere, a living ghost who had been told a different lie entirely. I owed it to my grandmother and to the ghost of Samuel to find him, to tell him he had a son. The search for Arthur Pennington was an obsession. I pored over online archives, census records, old phone directories. I was a woman possessed. After a week of dead ends, I found him. A retired contractor, living in a small coastal town in California. For a moment, I considered calling, but a story like this couldn't be told over the phone. It had to be delivered. The relics in the tin box had a final destination. I booked a flight. The entire journey felt surreal. I was flying across a country, carrying a 70-year-old secret in my carry-on bag. The tin box felt heavy on my lap, a condensed note of tragedy and love. I felt like a messenger in a Greek myth, tasked with delivering a truth so profound it could either destroy a man or set him free. Arthur Pennington lived in a small, modest bungalow that smelled of sea salt and sawdust. He was a small, frail man, his hands gnarled by a lifetime of work, but his eyes were a startlingly clear blue. The eyes my grandmother had written about. He moved slowly, cautiously, as he led me into his living room. He had agreed to see me after I sent him a short, cryptic letter mentioning I was Evelyn Walker's granddaughter and that I had something of hers to give him. We sat in a heavy, expectant silence for a long moment before I could speak. Lily, Mr. Pennington, Arthur, thank you for seeing me. I know this is unusual. Arthur, his voice was soft, raspy with age. When you get to be my age, not much is unusual, but your letter. I haven't heard Evelyn's name spoken aloud in a very long time. Is she? Lily, she passed away a few weeks ago. I'm so sorry. Narrator, he closed his clear blue eyes, a wave of ancient pain passing over his face. He nodded slowly. I didn't say anything else. Instead, I reached into my bag and placed the rusted tin box on the coffee table between us. His eyes fixed on it. Lily, she kept this for 70 years. She wanted someone to find it, I think. I think she wanted you to know what was inside. Narrator, with trembling hands, he reached out and lifted the lid. He stared into the box. I watched as he carefully, reverently, lifted out the tiny leather shoes. He held one in the palm of his hand, his thumb stroking the cracked leather. He didn't cry. The emotion was too deep, too old for tears. It was a grief that had been petrified. Arthur, he whispered the words, more to himself than to me. My God. I remember these. We saw them in a shop window, she said. She said they were the perfect shoes for a boy to see the world in. Lily, she had a son, Arthur. You had a son. Narrator, I told him everything then. I told him about the diaries, the birth, the 5 months of secret joy. And I told him about the well. He listened, his face a mask of profound, motionless sorrow, his gnarled hand never releasing the tiny shoe. Arthur. They told me he was stillborn, her father. That man looked me in the eye and told me the baby was born sleeping. He called it a mercy. Lily, his name was Samuel, and she loved him more than anything. She never ever forgot you. Narrator. After a long time, he went to a small wooden desk in the corner. He fumbled in a drawer and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From a hidden flap, he extracted a tiny, folded photo booth strip, cracked at the seams. He handed it to me. It was of him and Evelyn, squeezed together, making silly faces at the camera. They were impossibly young, their faces alight with a love that was so fierce it defied the faded, black and white image. On the back, in my grandmother's looping script, was one word: forever. Arthur, she should have this back, he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. A promise is a promise. Narrator, I took the photograph. I had come to deliver a history of sorrow, and in return, he had given me the one thing that had been missing from the box: a single, preserved moment of their pure, untarnished joy. Outro. Narrator. The flight back from California was different. I was no longer carrying a burden. I was carrying a gift. The small, folded photo booth strip felt warm in my pocket, a stark contrast to the cold, heavy weight of the tin box I had carried on the journey out. I had gone seeking the end of a story of tragedy, but Arthur had given me back its beginning. A beginning full of laughter and silly faces, and the promise of a forever that had, in its own strange, heartbreaking way, been kept. The revenge was complete, but it didn't taste like ashes or victory. It tasted like truth. When I walked back into my grandmother's house, the air had changed. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by a quiet that felt peaceful, settled. The ghosts were no longer restless. They had been heard. I walked up to her bedroom and took the small, faded photograph from my pocket. I smoothed it out and placed it in a simple silver frame I had bought. I set it on her bedside table, right where she would have seen it every morning and every night. Evelyn and Arthur, young and deliriously in love, their faces pressed together, immortalized in a four-frame strip of film. Her forever finally brought home. I didn't sell the house. I couldn't. It was no longer a house of whispers. It was a library of truth, and I was its keeper. The garden became my project, my therapy. The work was slow, arduous. I spent weeks pulling up the thorny, tangled weeds that had choked the life out of the soil for decades. Each weed I pulled felt like a lie I was uprooting. I tilled the soil, enriching it, preparing it for new life. It was hard, painful work, my muscles aching, my hands raw. Healing, I learned, is not a gentle process. Arthur and I speak on the phone every Sunday. I tell him about the garden's progress. He, with the knowledge of a man who loved a girl who loved flowers, suggests what to plant. Evelyn always loved peonies, he told me one afternoon, his voice thick with memory. So I planted peonies, and roses, and lavender, and a small Japanese maple tree in the spot where the dying elm had been. The garden is slowly being reborn. It is a slow, quiet apology from the present to the past. Last month, a small, simple stone of granite was delivered. I had it placed at the foot of the weeping angel, who no longer seems to be crying in sorrow, but weeping in gentle remembrance. The inscription is simple. There are no dates, no eulogies, just a name: Samuel Evan Pennington. I gave him his father's name, an act of rebellion against my great grandfather's tyranny, a final, definitive correction to the historical record. His life was no longer a shameful secret of the Walker family. It was now a cherished, acknowledged memory of the Pennington family. My grandmother's revenge, I finally understood, was not an act of destruction. It was the ultimate act of creation. She could not bring her son back to life, so she did the next best thing. She brought his story back. She knew the silence was the real killer, the poison that had seeped through the generations. Her final act on this earth was to craft a key, write a riddle, and trust that the granddaughter with her eyes would be brave enough to unlock the truth and speak it aloud. We think we know the people who live beside us. We think we know our parents, our grandparents. We see their present, but their pasts are deep, uncharted oceans filled with shipwrecks and lost treasures. The greatest gift you can give them, and yourself, in to ask about the voyage. To listen to their stories. Don't wait until all you have left is a key and a riddle. Thank you all for taking this long, difficult journey with me and for listening to Evelyn's and Arthur's and Samuel's story. It means the world to me to be able to share it. If their story touched you, please give this video a like and subscribe for more stories from the past. Until next time, take care of each other.